The summer air in New Braunfels, Texas, still carried the lingering heat when Kasey Halford vanished from the house on Gruene Road, a quiet neighborhood everyone thought was perfectly safe. That evening began with the smell of dry grass, the chirping of insects, and the humid breeze from the Guadalupe River slipping through the slightly ajar back door. At 9:12 p.m., Kasey's mother walked into the kitchen and saw the TV still on, a glass of water still warm on the table, and the homework notebook open to the exact page her daughter had been writing on before she left for work. The purple floral nightgown Kasey always wore at night was hanging neatly behind the door, the one Mrs. Halford had washed and folded for her just that morning. The elderly mother stood motionless in the dead silent house, and the moment she realized her daughter wasn't anywhere in that darkness set off a chain of events that would stretch across 3 decades and haunt New Braunfels to this day. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. A summer evening in 1989 in New Braunfels, Texas, carried the signature heat of the hill country, humid air mixed with the smell of dry earth, the scent of freshly cut grass still lingering from the afternoon, and the relentless chorus of cicadas blending with other insects echoing from the tree-lined stretch of Gruene Road. It was the kind of evening any local could describe without glancing at a clock, a hazy, soothing peacefulness that made time slip away unnoticed. Inside the small white house at 214 Gruene Road, the yellow glow from the living room spilled onto the front yard, painting a familiar scene the Halford family had known for years: a little porch, a few aloe vera pots, an old swing creaking softly whenever the breeze passed through. Inside, 13-year-old Kasey Lynn Halford, her brown hair tied back neatly, was spending a completely ordinary evening like dozens of others when her mom worked the night shift at the pharmacy downtown. Nothing seemed out of place. Kasey sat in front of the TV, legs tucked under a thin blanket, holding her half-finished homework notebook. The TV volume was low enough for her to hear, but not loud enough to drown out the summer sounds outside. Around 8 o'clock, Kasey got up, poured herself another glass of cold water from the fridge, took a few sips, and set it down on the coffee table. The air in the house was growing stuffy, so she walked to the back door and pushed it open just a crack, hoping to catch the night breeze. The curtains swayed gently, creating a soft rhythm on the floor. The house was filled with those familiar sounds: wind, TV, the faint clink of glass on wood, all blending into an evening that gave no hint of anything unusual. Every detail was so normal that no one could have imagined those moments would be the last ones the house ever held Kasey's presence. When the wall clock passed 9, the front door opened, and Kasey's mother stepped in after a longer than expected shift. She called her daughter's name, not loudly, but enough to carry through the downstairs. No answer. She set her bag down and glanced around the living room. The TV was still on, the show half-watched. On the table, Kasey's glass of water was still warm when she touched it. The back door was ajar, exactly how Kasey always left it when she wanted fresh air. The thin blanket was draped casually over the sofa, the homework notebook open to the same page she'd seen that afternoon. Everything was exactly where it should be. Everything except one thing: Kasey wasn't there. She called again, louder this time, then hurried upstairs. Bedroom empty. Bathroom empty. Nothing overturned. No chairs out of place. No broken windows. Just a heavy, oppressive silence, as if the whole house was holding its breath. That silence sent a chill down her spine. She stepped out to the backyard, scanned along the fence line, peered into the darkness, lit only by faint neighbor light. No footprints, no sounds, no clue to explain her daughter's absence. The initial confusion turned into sharp, icy fear. Her daughter would never leave the house this late. Never. She went back inside, stood by the landline, hand trembling slightly. That moment stretched like a timeless void. Then she picked up the receiver and dialed 911. She wouldn't just leave at this hour, she told the dispatcher when they answered. Less than 10 minutes after the 911 call, 2 New Braunfels Police Department patrol cars pulled up in front of 214 Gruene Road. Under the flashing red and blue lights, cutting through the stifling summer night, the first officers entered with the focused calm of people used to emergency checks, yet alert enough to sense something in the mother's voice that told them this wasn't just a teenager sneaking out. They came in through the still open front door and immediately took in the layout. The living room was lit by the glow of the TV, volume low but steady, creating a background hum that contrasted with the room's eerie stillness. One officer turned off the TV to eliminate the noise, and instantly the house fell into near total silence. That helped them hear any sound, and made it clear there was nothing but their own breathing. They began establishing the primary crime scene boundary, marking off areas inside the house and yard, where potential evidence needed to be preserved. No one said it out loud, but their actions showed they all sensed this wasn't simply a runaway. An officer noted the initial observations: no broken furniture, no signs of a struggle, nothing obviously knocked out of place. But as they moved deeper into the living room, small details started to stand out like blemishes on an otherwise perfect picture. The back door, instead of being flush with the frame, was slightly off to the right, leaving an odd gap as if someone had given it a casual push when closing. An officer gently touched the knob, tested the swing, and noted, "Door doesn't align with natural closing direction." The still warm glass of water sat on the coffee table exactly as the mother described, and by touch, they confirmed it hadn't been set down long ago. This wasn't the glass of someone planning to leave, it was the glass of someone who intended to come right back to their seat. The long sofa was exactly where it belonged, but the nearby armchair had been pulled slightly off its usual indentations in the carpet. 5 to 7 centimeters, too subtle for a casual eye, but enough for an investigator to flag. Nothing proved the chair had been shoved hard, but the shift didn't match the normal movement pattern of someone watching TV alone. These early notes weren't conclusive evidence, but they were valuable for shaping lines of inquiry. Lead investigator Lieutenant Ramirez walked slowly around the room, eyes constantly shifting between objects. He noted the unnatural stillness of the house. He checked the front door, no pry marks, lower windows all locked. A quick scan of the back porch, the ground still held evening moisture, but no clear indentations. Everything seemed arranged to remain untouched, and that very perfection unsettled him. Missing person cases usually left some disturbance. This one didn't. Ramirez ordered all lights turned off, except in the living room, to better see reflections on surfaces. He stood at the back door, looking down the hallway, then out to the yard. He said quietly, "If the girl walked out back on her own, she had a reason. But this door says she didn't close it herself." Another officer reported the upstairs had been checked. No one, no sounds, no open windows. Ramirez ordered the upstairs sealed to preserve the scene. With years of experience, he knew every passing minute mattered, but he also knew missing one tiny detail could throw the investigation off for months, even years. His next order: collect any potential trace evidence within a 20-foot radius of the back door, even if they hadn't yet confirmed that was Kasey's exit point. After finishing the first sweep, Ramirez stepped back and surveyed the whole house again. No pry marks, no spilled objects, no signs of screaming or struggle. The house seemed frozen at the exact moment Kasey vanished from it. And to someone trained to read scene language, that was a clearer signal than any scratch or shard. He looked up at the mother still trembling near the kitchen door, his voice low but firm. "We're treating this as a criminal missing person case." And that was when the real investigation began. The summer night atmosphere in New Braunfels seemed to shift the instant Lieutenant Ramirez officially classified it as a criminal disappearance. The entire team immediately switched from initial welfare check to active search mode. Without needing lengthy instructions, they fanned out around the house in a 3-block radius pattern, close enough to catch fresh traces, wide enough to cover any direction Kasey might have been taken or left under duress. Flashlights clicked on, sweeping long beams across sidewalks, neighbors' driveways, narrow passages between wooden fences. One officer released a K9 from the front of the house. The dog sniffed deeply along faint shoe marks on the ground, then pulled hard toward the backyard. Ramirez followed at a distance to avoid contaminating the trail. As the K9 moved through the narrow passage between the Halford house and the neighbors, the team's focus sharpened. This was prime ground for footprints or scent. The dog paused briefly, sniffed around the base of a thorn bush, then suddenly lunged toward the wooden fence. Ramirez noted the change in the dog's behavior. It wasn't the scent of someone casually passing through, it was purposeful movement. But just seconds later, when the dog reached the moss-covered old fence, it lost the trail. It circled the area 3 times, sniffing hard, then looked back at its handler as if to say the scent ended there. Bad sign, either Kasey was lifted over the fence, or whoever took her blocked or masked the scent at that spot. Ramirez kept emotion out of it. He noted trail lost at fence, possible over the fence carry. Team 2 continued sweeping the front, checking every driveway, lawn and patch of shadow the streetlights didn't reach. One officer examined mailboxes, manhole covers, roadside bushes, places kids sometimes leave traces if dragged or if something falls in panic. Nothing stood out, only the spreading silence that blanketed the neighborhood as neighbors began peeking from behind curtains, watching the search team move like shadows under flashlight beams. Around 11 p.m., Team 3 expanded the search toward the corner of the backyard, where the Halford fence met the long vacant neighboring lot. The ground there was uneven, overgrown with tall grass, rarely walked on, and therefore most likely to hold evidence. Flashlight beams swept across the lumpy clay and weed surface. One officer knelt, gently parted the grass with a pen. Then he spotted a corner of white paper, small, thin, dirt-stained. He picked it up with gloved fingers and turned it under the light. A diagonal tear ran along one edge, and on the other side, faint blue ballpoint ink showed a few familiar letters in the round, small handwriting typical of a middle schooler. Ramirez stepped over immediately. He carefully unfolded the paper just enough to read part of the lined surface. If this scrap really came from Kasey's notebook, it was the first physical evidence she had been in this area. Very close to where the K9 lost the scent. No one voiced the speculation. The first rule of search protocol is never let emotion or assumption steer the process. Ramirez signaled the officer to seal the paper in an evidence bag right away. No chatter, no conclusions. They worked with the cold precision of years of training. Afterward, the team swept a 15-foot radius around the paper's location for any scratches, fibers, or ground wear. But the area had dried in the night breeze, making fresh marks harder to spot. The K9 was brought back to the fence line once more, but still couldn't pick the scent up again. Ramirez studied the fence for a long time. He noticed one board slightly out of alignment, and beneath it the grass was thinner, as if something had recently pressed it down. He touched the plank lightly, not enough to alter the scene, but enough to test it. Not broken, not loose, but freshly indented, a detail worth noting even if not conclusive yet. He turned back to the waiting team. No one spoke, but the air had changed. Kasey's disappearance no longer looked like a simple runaway. As the clock passed midnight, Ramirez called an end to the 3-block search to prepare for a more systematic sweep at dawn. But before leaving the corner lot, he glanced back at where the paper was found. Small, torn, but enough to make him feel something was waiting to surface. Not hard evidence, just a first sign, a tiny one. But in cases like this, those tiny things are often where everything begins. Ramirez said nothing more. He simply wrote in his brief report, Item 01 recovered, no speculation. Then he walked away, his silhouette blending into the flashlight beams of the team pulling back. Inside 214 Gruene Road, everything remained as silent as the moment before everything changed. And from here, the investigation had only one direction left: find the path Kasey took out of that house, and find out why. The next morning, as the sun was just rising over the rooftops along Gruene Road, the new Braunfels PD forensics team returned to the scene. The early light made the thin layer of dew on the grass shimmer under their first footsteps. The air was still cooler than the heavy heat of the night before, but the silence was identical, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for answers about Kasey's disappearance. Lieutenant Ramirez led the way, holding the file of notes from the previous night. He had barely slept, reviewing every jotting, every photo, every description his team collected. What he wanted this morning was to determine whether the first clue, the torn piece of notebook paper, had simply blown there by chance, or was real evidence of the girl's path. The forensics team began remapping the backyard. They divided the space into small grid squares to ensure nothing was missed on the ground or fence. Forensics is a job of patience and sharp eyes, and in missing person cases like this, every tiny trace can open a new investigative door. One technician crouched near where the paper was found the night before. As he gently pushed the grass aside, sunlight hit the still damp soil, and he froze. "Ramirez, got something," he called quietly. Ramirez walked over and knelt beside him. On the light brown dirt mixed with weeds was a long indentation, not distinct, but the left edge deeper than the right. Not a full shoe print, but not a natural depression either. Ramirez tilted his head, viewing it from multiple angles to gauge depth. Another tech measured the distance between visible points, and compared it to prints logged the night before. "Not the Halford family shoes," she said after a quick check. "Larger size, outer edge worn." The group stood still for a few seconds. No one said it, but they all knew this was an adult's footprint, not Kasey's. Ramirez ordered the print cordoned off, and the search expanded outward from that spot. Forensics began placing small marker flags to trace the direction of soil compression. Just minutes later, another tech called out, "Here too." Another faint indentation about a meter from the first. Then a third, barely visible, but enough to reveal the direction of travel. When connected, the path was clear toward the railroad tracks behind the row of houses, where empty land stretched out like a natural corridor of darkness. Ramirez folded his arms, staring along that invisible trail. The footprints didn't lead toward the main road or an easy escape route. They went straight to the tracks, a deserted, isolated area with little light and no nearby homes. "If that's the direction this person took," one tech said, "high chance he was leading someone, or dragging." Ramirez didn't answer right away. He crouched again, studying the first print. If an adult walked normally on damp ground, the prints would be even and roughly the same depth. But the first was deeper than the second, and the third nearly faded. That suggested one of two things. Either the person suddenly slowed, or they were exerting effort to stay balanced while pulling something, or someone along. Kasey was small, 13 years old, not heavy. If she was carried or dragged, an adult's prints would sink deeper at the start. Ramirez had the first print's location compared to where the K9 lost the scent the night before. When a tech brought out the sketched map, they quickly confirmed the scent loss point, and the first footprint aligned almost perfectly. This was no longer coincidence. Tension in the group rose. Forensics continued carefully expanding the search. They looked for similar traces, shoe prints, scrape marks, depressions, or fibers caught on weeds. One tech found a thin drag mark on the damp soil, like something small being pulled. Around it, the dirt was lightly disturbed, but not enough to identify shape. Still, the drag mark was significant. It ran parallel to the footprints. "Any return prints?" Ramirez asked. The team meticulously checked the ground in the opposite direction, moving back toward the house. After 10 careful minutes, they concluded, no returning footprints, no reversal, no pivoting, no wear from movement back. Whoever left those prints went one way only, out. No return, no pause, no branching. "What do you think?" a tech asked. Ramirez gazed along the invisible trail toward the tracks, still in shadow from the morning sun. He wasn't one to voice guesses easily, but he knew this couldn't be logged neutrally, like the night before. "One direction," he said slowly. "No return." He paused, then added, "Very high probability she was taken." No one in the group disagreed. No one said more. The evidence wasn't enough to lock in a scenario, but it was enough to rule out many others. Those faint traces in the dirt that morning, though not sharp, were like the first small pieces of a much larger picture, a picture still missing countless parts, but now at least it had an initial outline, and that outline led straight away from the Halford house, toward the old railroad tracks running parallel to the Guadalupe River, a path Kasey Lynn Halford would never have chosen on her own on a peaceful summer night, like the one before. As morning edged toward noon, the temperature climbed and heat shimmered off the pavement, making the scenery ripple under the sun, while the forensics team continued cordoning off the backyard of the Halford house, Lieutenant Ramirez moved to the next step, canvassing neighbors who lived around the property, especially anyone who might have seen or heard anything unusual the night before. Cases like this rarely produced perfect witnesses, people who heard everything clearly or saw every movement. Instead, you always got fragmented, imperfect memories distorted by distance, lighting, or timing. But sometimes, when those fragments were laid side by side, they painted a picture no one expected. Ramirez and a younger officer started with the house directly across from the Halfords, where the porch light stayed on all night. The woman who answered was Mrs. Richardson, an older lady with curly silver hair and the sharp-eyed look of someone who had lived in the neighborhood long enough to notice everything that happened in front of her house. She said right away that she didn't see clearly, but there was one thing she was certain of: sometime after 8 o'clock, she saw a small figure walking along the sidewalk. She thought it was Kasey. "The girl walks by here a few times a week," she said, "so I figured last night was the same." When Ramirez pressed for details on lighting, distance, and direction, she couldn't give specifics. "I wasn't wearing my glasses," she admitted, "but I think it was her." Ramirez took notes without comment. He knew this kind of statement. It could be right, it could be completely wrong, and the most dangerous thing was that it could nudge the investigation a few degrees off course, if not cross-checked carefully. They moved on to the house diagonally to the left, where a sleepy-looking 28-year-old named Gary Logan answered the door. When Ramirez asked if he'd noticed anything unusual the night before, Gary scratched his chin, stared at the ground for a moment, then said, "I saw somebody standing near the Halford fence." The words made both Ramirez and the officer with him freeze. This matched the 10-year-old boy's statement from the night before, but now it came from an adult with a direct sightline to the back of the Halford property. "How clearly did you see him?" Ramirez asked. "Honestly, not very," Gary replied. "Just the shape of a man, tall, thin, standing right by the fence, but when I looked again, he was gone." Ramirez asked for an estimated time. Gary said around 8:30, or a little before. When asked which way the figure went, Gary wasn't sure. The streetlight was dim. Tree shadows covered part of the view. "He might have just been passing through," Gary added. "I could be wrong." The statement added another layer of doubt. Not clear, not consistent, not solid, but too hard to ignore. Leaving Gary's house, Ramirez paused in the driveway and looked back at the Halford fence. Two unrelated witnesses mentioning the exact same spot made him feel that location mattered more than anything forensics had found so far, but he said nothing. He didn't want to release a theory into the air, while everything was still too vague. They continued to the third house, farther south at the corner where Gruene Road met a narrow, unlit stretch. A young woman in her early 30s answered, still holding a broom. She said she hadn't seen Kasey or anyone near the fence, but she had heard something, car lights coming on. Ramirez looked up sharply. "Can you be more specific?" She frowned, thinking back. "I was cleaning the kitchen when I heard an engine turn over, but not the long cranking kind, just a click of the headlights coming on, then tires rolling slowly, not loud, not fast, but definitely a car trying to move quietly." "Did you see the car?" "No," she shook her head. "I just heard it. I don't know whose or where it came from." Another incomplete statement. No plate, no color, no direction, just sound. A single data point in a noisy night. When all three statements were logged, Ramirez stood in the Halford's front yard, opened his notebook, and read the lines again. Witness 1. Someone who thinks they saw Kasey walking. Witness 2. A tall, thin man standing near the fence. Witness 3. Headlights clicking on in the dark. None were completely wrong. None were strong enough to confirm anything. They were like puzzle pieces dropped on the floor, mixed up, missing edges. One person saw something, one heard something, one only guessed. Three fragments pointing three different ways. Kasey left the house on foot by herself. Someone was lurking by the fence. A car moved away in secret. Three possibilities. Three investigative paths, none strong enough to rule out the others. Ramirez closed the notebook. He knew he needed more to pin down Kasey's route, but he also knew cases like this never handed investigators a perfect piece at the start. Instead, they gave broken, jagged, misaligned fragments, and forced you to figure out which ones actually belonged to the picture. That morning, the picture was still pitch black, but at least they were beginning to see the outline of the truth, even if it appeared blurred and incomplete. The only thing Ramirez was certain of was that all three statements, contradictory as they were, had value, and that very contradiction was dangerous, because it could pull the investigation in three completely different directions. Or worse, all three could be true, with each witness only catching a piece of the same event. By early afternoon, Ramirez decided to expand the search beyond the 3-block radius. The footprints leading toward the railroad tracks, combined with the three conflicting statements that all suggested movement outside the backyard, told him clinging to the immediate area around the Halford house would yield nothing more. The next logical zone was along the Guadalupe River bank, only a few minutes' walk away. The river curved quietly around town, clear but deep, its banks full of dark patches under tree canopies where light barely reached. If anything had been dropped, tossed or discarded in a hurry, the river or its banks were the most likely place to look. The search team moved to the river around 3 p.m., when the sun was at its peak and heat rose off the rocky banks like steam. Still, the pace never slowed. Flashlights were swapped for reflective panels to probe shaded areas. Metal detecting poles were brought for small objects, and the lead searchers were used to following traces most people would miss. Reaching the riverbank, Ramirez paused a few seconds to scan the scene. He looked along the water, watching the gentle current slide beneath overhanging branches. If someone left the Halford area, carrying anything belonging to Kasey, there were two possibilities. They took it with them, or dumped it where no one would easily find it. This river, with its tall grass, stone steps down to the water, and damp hollows, was exactly that kind of place. The team spread out east and west along the bank in three small groups. One officer pushed through trailside grass, another checked the water's edge, and a forensic tech at the rear flagged spots for later detailed analysis. No loud talking, just the crunch of boots on dry grass, and the louder, harsher insect buzz of daytime. Near a popular fishing spot, a young officer named Walker suddenly stopped. "Got something here," he said, crouching beneath a large sycamore. Ramirez hurried over and looked where Walker's flashlight pointed. Under a layer of dry leaves and thin dirt lay a small piece of fabric, about the size of a palm, pale-colored and slightly muddy. Walker picked it up with gloved fingers, and the group fell silent. The fabric was gently unfolded, a child's handkerchief, the kind kids often carry to wipe their hands or just keep in a pocket out of habit. No special pattern, just plain cotton, with simple stitching at the corners. What caught Ramirez's attention was a faint brownish stain at one corner, not clearly mud or anything else. "Does anyone know if Kasey carried a handkerchief?" Walker asked quietly. Ramirez didn't answer right away. He knew that question needed confirmation from the family, and more importantly, forensic analysis, not guesswork. The handkerchief was immediately sealed in an evidence bag. No one touched it again. Ramirez ordered the exact find spot, marked with a reflective stake, and the search radius expanded another 15 meters. If this handkerchief was connected to Kasey, there was no telling whether it fell, was snatched, or was thrown away. The possibility it was unrelated couldn't be ruled out either, but in an investigation where every centimeter mattered, the handkerchief could not be dismissed. Forensics logged shape, size, condition, moisture level compared to surroundings, and wind direction the previous night. Details that might reveal how long it had been there. A tech carefully photographed it from multiple angles, used a ruler for scale, and labeled it Evidence #02. In 1989, the new Braunfels Forensics Unit, like most in Texas, couldn't deeply analyze trace biological evidence without visible blood or hair. The faint brown stains could be mud, clay, chalk, or anything else. Any DNA present was far too little for the technology of the time. The lab could try soil composition analysis, but results were rarely useful, so despite careful documentation, the handkerchief would go into the evidence pending further comparison category, a folder that existed in every case file, and usually held small, hard-to-identify items that couldn't yet be discarded. Ramirez understood the limitation. Still, he spent a few seconds looking at the sealed handkerchief before placing it in the transport box, not because it was definitely connected, but because it had been found in the wrong place, far enough from the Halford house that any item belonging to Kasey appearing there raised a huge question. The rest of the afternoon passed in heavy silence. No more evidence, no clear footprints, no certainty the handkerchief was a real trace or just something caught by chance. But to Ramirez, it was the first connecting point between the Halford house and the river area, a small sign that the case was more complicated than what they had seen inside the lit house the night before. Before leaving the riverbank, Ramirez wrote the final line of the temporary report for his commander: small pale handkerchief, found near river under sycamore canopy. No conclusion. Await comparison. He had no idea that item, downplayed today, would years later become one of the case's most crucial pieces. At that moment, it was just a cold scrap of cloth sealed in plastic, waiting for its story to be told. When the riverbank search wrapped up late in the afternoon, Ramirez returned to the Gruene Road neighborhood to re-examine the morning statements, especially the man standing near the fence. The detail had surfaced too many times in under 24 hours to be coincidence. First from the 10-year-old boy the night before, then from Gary Logan that morning, both pointing to the exact same spot behind the Halford house. The boy was the youngest witness, and his statement had been taken late at night, when chaos and fear made it hard to separate real memory from frightened imagination. Still, Ramirez wanted to hear it straight from the child, rather than rely on the night shift's vague notes. The boy lived 2 houses down, right beside the vacant lot where forensics had found the footprints and torn paper. His father was a quiet man who opened the door looking worried. He's still scared, the father said. He keeps saying he saw something last night, but I'm not sure he remembers right. Ramirez nodded, no pressure. He asked to speak with the boy in the living room, where the light was soft enough not to overwhelm him, but not so dim it felt threatening. When the boy appeared, still in a muddy t-shirt, eyes red from lack of sleep, Ramirez lowered his voice almost to a whisper. "You're not in trouble," he began. "I just want to hear what you saw last night. Tell me like you're telling your dad. No one's mad, no one's blaming you. We just need to know what happened." The boy swallowed hard, staring at his clasped hands. "I don't know if it's right," he whispered, "but I think I saw a man." Ramirez didn't interrupt. He let the boy find the words. "A man," the boy continued, "standing right by Aunt Halford's fence." The words were identical to the night report, but hearing them directly from the child gave them a different weight, clearer, more timid, but real. "When did you see him?" Ramirez asked. "Any time is fine, just guess." When I went out back to get my ball," the boy answered. "It was dark but Aunt Halford's porch light was on. I saw the shape of a man right by the fence, near the big bush. Did you see his face?" The boy shook his head. "No, he had his back to the light. I just saw the shape, tall, I think, not like the grown-ups here. He stood still for a bit, then walked fast that way." The boy pointed in the exact direction forensics had marked, toward the railroad tracks. Ramirez glanced at the father for confirmation of honesty. The father shrugged. "Last night he couldn't sleep. He kept repeating the same thing." Ramirez continued. "Were you scared?" The boy nodded. "I ran inside. I thought he saw me, but I'm not sure." The young officer with Ramirez wrote down every detail. Ramirez began mentally slotting the statement onto the timeline. Man's silhouette, by the fence, heading toward the tracks, same spot as the footprints, same direction as the torn paper, same place the K9 lost the scent. Things were starting to take on a logical shape, not complete, but forming. Ramirez asked a few more questions to verify without pushing the boy into false memory. When it ended, the boy looked up at him, not scared, but seeking reassurance. He wasn't the only one who saw it. Ramirez placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing. Thank you for telling me." Leaving the house, the younger officer said, "Sir, the kid could be imagining it. Kids sometimes think they see things that aren't there." Ramirez didn't answer right away. He looked back at the fence one more time. He had heard enough witness statements over the years to tell the difference between fear-inflated stories and real, if hazy, memory. Maybe, he said after a pause. But the people who hide in shadows don't wait for anyone to believe in them. The younger officer went quiet. Ramirez opened his notebook and underlined 2 words. Fence. Man's silhouette. Yet even with that emphasis, he knew this would face pushback in the official report. The boy was an unreliable witness. No facial description, no identifying details, no physical evidence linking the figure to Kasey's disappearance. And so, like many child witnesses in other cases, the boy's statement was filed under unable to corroborate. A senior investigator with more years than Ramirez dismissed it when reading the report. Kids at night see ghosts. Don't let it steer us when we have no hard evidence. Ramirez didn't argue, but he added one line to the last page of his notebook. If the boy is right, he was there at least twice. No one on the team knew that the trembling words of a 10-year-old about a man by the fence would become a key piece of the puzzle 35 years later. But on that day, under the harsh Texas summer sun, that small statement floated among countless uncertain details, its value unknown to everyone, except Ramirez. He felt something wrong closing in, but had no words for it yet. And sometimes the things without words are the most important. While Ramirez reviewed all the statements in his car, the radio crackled. Another officer reported that the owner of a VHS rental store, 3 blocks from the Halford house, said the exterior security camera might have caught something the night Kasey vanished. In 1989, civilian security cameras were extremely rare. Only stores worried about petty theft had them, and VHS quality was grainy, noisy, and fragile. Still, any footage at this stage was worth checking. Ramirez headed straight there. The store sat on a corner, its neon sign flickering pale red, windows lined with action and cartoon tapes. The owner, a short, stocky man with prematurely gray hair, stood nervously in front of the VCR. "I'm not sure it'll help," he said, as soon as Ramirez walked in. "The camera's ancient, but I think I saw someone run past." Ramirez asked him to cue the tape. He pulled up a chair, eyes glued to the snowy low-resolution screen, where large light blobs floated past. The camera was mounted outside, aimed at the street, capturing only about 10 feet in front of the store. Then, at roughly 8:40 p.m., a small figure dashed across the edge of the frame. No clear face, no clear clothing, but the speed and size made the entire team freeze for several seconds. "Stop," Ramirez said. "Rewind slow." They rewound, zoomed as far as possible, stepped frame by frame, but the image remained just a blur of motion. Streetlight glare revealed faint outlines of head and shoulders, a girl short, running fast, arms held forward, as if clutching something or keeping balance. In that moment, Ramirez felt he was looking at Kasey, though he knew it was the natural reaction any investigator has when an image matches the description they're hunting. The younger officer beside him blurted, "Jesus, that has to be Kasey." The owner nodded vigorously. "That's what I thought. I've watched it over and over. Likely, possibly, certain, no, but in missing child cases, even a slim chance carries enormous weight." Ramirez ordered the tape copied, and the original sealed as evidence. Everything was handled strictly, timestamp logged, signatures collected, tape placed in an anti-magnetic sleeve. That evening, a quick briefing at the scene shifted the investigation's direction. If the girl was running this way, one officer said, she left via the main road, not the tracks. Another countered, then why the footprints toward the tracks? Maybe the camera angle's off, maybe a different time. The room grew chaotic. The 3 conflicting morning statements had already shaken things, and now the VHS tape, grainy as it was, added a brand new branch. Ramirez knew the tape wasn't clear enough to identify anyone, but he couldn't ignore it. "Treat this direction as a separate investigative thread for now," he said curtly, "but do not drop the footprints or the fence area." For the next 3 weeks, the girl running on the main road theory became priority. They knocked on every door along 3 blocks, asking if anyone saw a girl run past. They cross-referenced the tape's timestamp with the third witness's car starting sound. They mapped possible routes Kasey might have taken if she fled in panic. But everything led to dead ends. No one saw the girl, no one heard running, No one remembered anyone resembling Kasey near the VHS store. No second clue supported what the tape appeared to show. The only thing the team discovered, after nearly 100 hours of searching, was no one was in that area at that time. A perfect void. The VHS tape, once a beacon of hope, became noise. Ramirez watched it more than 10 times in a single day, searching for any background motion, any reflection on glass, anything to confirm who that child was. Nothing. Just motion blur. A small figure. 12 meaningless frames. By the end of week 3, Ramirez wrote in the internal report, "Identity of child on tape unverifiable. No connection to footprints or evidence #01 and #02. Temporarily classified as non-probative." It was the first major misdirection of the investigation, but an unavoidable one. No investigator could ignore the only recorded image of a child running that night, without treating it as a real lead. The VHS tape was sealed in an envelope and sent to evidence storage. A note was added to the file, "Insufficient for confirmation, reanalyze if future technology permits." No one on the team could imagine that future would take 35 years, and no one knew that when modern image enhancement technology was finally applied in 2024, the tape that once convinced the entire team they were watching Kasey run past the VHS store would be re-examined and deliver a cold, definitive conclusion. The girl in the footage is not Kasey Halford, but in 1989, all they had was a grainy clip, a big assumption, and a 3-week detour that answered nothing. Instead of shedding light, the VHS tape only thickened the darkness, and whatever that darkness was hiding, no one knew. But Ramirez knew one thing for certain: the silence of that image was more terrifying than any scream, and the case had already started veering off course because of that silence. After 3 weeks derailed by the VHS tape, the investigation circled back to square one, the physical evidence collected in the first 2 days. Ramirez, never one to rely entirely on any single lead, decided to re-examine every forensic document from scratch. Starting with the smallest items the team had gathered: the footprints, the drag marks in the dirt, the torn piece of paper, and especially one detail almost no one had paid attention to at the time: a tiny polyester fiber found in the corner of the Halford backyard, near where the scrap of paper was discovered. That item had been picked up on the morning of the second day and labeled Evidence #03. It was so small it needed a magnifying glass to see the weave clearly. When it reached the new Braunfels forensics lab, 1989 technology could only determine fabric type, thread thickness, weave pattern, and color by naked eye under basic lighting. The original report was 4 lines long, one of which was treated as definitive: dark blue polyester fiber, possible origin from victim's clothing or unidentified object. Just that short note became the basis for ruling out several potential persons of interest. At the time, one of the people briefly interviewed within the 3-block radius was a 19-year-old named Randall Jessup. He lived 2 streets over, had a minor record for disorderly conduct, and often hung around the VHS store parking lot. When asked about the night of the incident, Randall said he had walked from home to the convenience store and never went down Gruene Road. With no evidence he was lying, the interview lasted under 10 minutes. But one detail few remembered: at the time of the interview, Randall was wearing a light gray polyester jacket with no blue patches at all. Still, because the forensic report listed the fiber as dark blue, Randall was removed from further follow-up. The investigation then focused on individuals wearing blue clothing, especially heavier fabrics that shed fibers easily. And so the polyester fiber, though logged as evidence, inadvertently narrowed the suspect pool by the wrong color. The truth was, the fiber's color had been misrecorded from the very beginning. When Ramirez reread the file, something felt off. He clearly remembered the corner of the yard, where the footprints and torn paper were found: damp soil, dry grass, early morning light that could easily distort color perception. He went straight to the forensics lab and tracked down the lead technician from that shift, now much older but still sharp. "We didn't have spectral lamps," the tech said, "just yellow bulbs. Under that light, gray can look blue, but back then, we had nothing better." Ramirez closed his eyes for a few seconds. A slight lighting error, one inaccurate note, a color judged by eye, and the entire team had used it to shape the suspect profile. He asked to see the original 35mm film photos of the evidence. When blown up on screen, a younger tech standing beside him pointed straight at the fiber image. "No, that's not dark blue, that's gray. Light gray, maybe with a silvery sheen. The cheap industrial polyester from back then." No one in the room spoke. The silence was heavier than any conclusion. Small mistake, big consequences. Because of one color misidentification, the investigation had eliminated an entire group of suspects simply for not wearing blue. People in gray polyester jackets, t-shirts or pants, the most common color of the 1980s, were no longer considered noteworthy, even though gray was the actual match. Mistakes like this were common in 1980s forensics: limited technology, overworked teams, notes often based on eyesight and whatever light was in the room. But this was not a small mistake, it had shaped the entire direction of the case. Ramirez flipped through the reports, underlining every reference to evidence #03. Beside them, he wrote color misrecorded from the start. Revisit all interviewed persons wearing gray clothing. Then, at the bottom of the page, another note: never repeat this mistake, ever. That line was both a reminder to himself and an admission that the 3 weeks chasing the VHS lead might never have happened if forensics hadn't gotten the color wrong. In 1989, no one knew whose trail that mistake had caused them to miss. But years later, the person wearing a gray polyester jacket, the night Kasey vanished, would re-enter the file in a way no one expected. And it all began with one tiny fiber seen under the wrong light. By the end of summer 1989, after dozens of days searching, combing every meter of ground, collecting every tiny sample, and chasing leads that repeatedly hit dead ends, the disappearance of Kasey Lynn Halford began slipping off its original trajectory. The gray polyester fiber, mislabeled blue, the 3-week detour caused by the noisy VHS tape, the 3 conflicting witness statements, none strong enough for a breakthrough, all combined into a painful reality. The investigation had entered an empty phase. Kasey's disappearance produced no further noise, no ransom notes, no tip calls, no body, no DNA, no new witnesses, no signs of kidnapping for money, and no trace suggesting she had left Gruene Road any way other than the one they already knew: faint footprints, a torn scrap of paper, a pale handkerchief, and a grainy VHS screen. When fall arrived, and the oppressive heat gave way to the first cool winds, the case file still sat on Ramirez's desk like a weight. He reviewed every report page, every scene photo, every sealed evidence bag. Everything was potentially important, but nothing was strong enough. The polyester fiber, even after the color correction, was too generic to trace. The torn paper, just a fragment of a mass-produced notebook sold at every corner store in town. The handkerchief, an everyday kid item, too common for a solid link. The footprints, too faint for accurate sizing. From October onward, investigative meeting minutes grew shorter. Witness canvases were spaced weeks apart. Some officers were reassigned to newer cases. The Texas State Forensics Lab couldn't offer more. Technology stopped at microscopes, fiber measurement, and soil analysis. Nothing shifted the stalemate. One late November morning, Ramirez sat alone in the small briefing room with the brown evidence box. He opened it and looked at the sealed bags: handkerchief, torn paper, fiber, footprint photos. They looked more like forgotten trinkets than case-breaking clues. He knew that without new information, this file would follow the path so many small-town missing person cases had taken before: cooling off, going quiet, then shelved. Not because anyone gave up, but because there was nowhere left to go. In December 1989, the new Braunfels Police Department officially downgraded the case priority. The investigation wasn't closed, it simply shifted to pending, meaning it would wait for new leads. Ramirez hated that word. Pending sounded like a promise that would never be kept. He locked the file in a cabinet, stood silently for a long moment, then turned off the light. Through the 1990s, New Braunfels changed, population grew, new factories opened, the Riverwalk tourism area expanded, new cases appeared, some more serious, more urgent. Gradually, the Kasey Halford case was mentioned less in detective briefings. Many younger officers had never even heard the girl's name. Meanwhile, the evidence in the box aged year by year. Plastic bags yellowed, labels faded. The already pale polyester fiber grew paler. The torn paper became brittle. The VHS tape, stored in cold storage, still degraded. Whenever new personnel came in, Ramirez still recounted the case as a training lesson, the color mistake, letting a blurry tape dominate for 3 weeks, the importance of every tiny detail. Talking was one thing, having leads to follow was another. In 1993, an internal memo suggested re-interviewing some original witnesses, but when the team tried, most memories were gone. Mrs. Richardson, who thought she saw Kasey walking, was no longer sure. Gary Logan, who saw the man by the fence, had moved out of state. The woman who heard the car lights click on wasn't certain whether it was that night or the night before. Memories crumbled, eroded by time until only blanks remained. In 1996, the state lab froze all old samples with no further testing value, including Kasey's handkerchief. In 1998, the evidence box was moved to a new storage facility. In 1999, when Ramirez left the detective unit for a supervisory role, he carried the weight of the only case he had never been able to answer. Then, entering the year 2000, the Kasey Halford file was officially stamped in red, cold case. Not closed, not forgotten, just no path forward. An unsolved case tucked between unanswerable questions and evidence that wasn't strong enough. The file lay quiet in the dark of storage. The pages inside didn't call out, didn't hint at anything, but in that long silence, the crucial clue was still there, hidden inside details that 1989 simply lacked the tools to see. And the case, though cold, was not dead. It was only waiting. The year 2000 ended with the Kasey Halford file joining the cold case list, but that didn't mean everything stayed buried forever. Nearly 7 years later, in the summer of 2007, the New Braunfels Police Department launched a program to re-examine old unsolved cases, an effort to re-evaluate files that had stalled due to the technological limits of the 1980s and 1990s. Among dozens of boxes pulled from storage, the one labeled 1989 Halford KL sat at the bottom of a shelf under a thin layer of dust, as if it had accepted its fate of being forgotten. The detective assigned to review it was Daniel Mercer, recently transferred from San Marcos. Young, meticulous, not yet experienced enough to be cynical, but tough enough not to be discouraged by the shadow of old cases. Mercer opened the box, flipped through yellowed evidence bags and faded notes, and read non-stop for 3 hours straight. The more he read, the more something felt wrong, not because evidence was missing, but because evidence had been dismissed too quickly. 3 small details kept repeating that no one had ever properly connected: the 10-year-old boy's statement, the direction of the footprints toward the railroad tracks, and the location of the handkerchief on the Guadalupe River bank. 3 scattered details, 3 loose pieces that weren't enough for evidence in 1989, but Mercer looked at them the way a young detective looks at what the previous generation had accepted as dead ends. Why were they never linked? Why treat each piece as isolated? Mercer began taking meticulous notes. First line, the 10-year-old boy. The child's statement had been labeled, unable to corroborate, but when Mercer read the description, he paused longer than usual. The boy described a man standing right by the Halford fence, the exact spot where footprints and the torn paper were found. The boy even pointed the direction the man walked, toward the tracks. That matched the footprint direction recorded by forensics with startling precision. If a child's statement lines up with adult footprints, Mercer thought, can we really dismiss it? He moved to the footprints section. The 1989 forensics text had noted, deepest print first, then fading, heading north toward the tracks. Not an easy route, not one a child would choose at night. Large prints, long stride, no return prints. That matched the boy perfectly. The man stood for a moment, then walked quickly toward the tracks. Mercer marked it in red. Finally, he reviewed the handkerchief. Evidence #02. The 1989 Tex had filed it as undetermined, because there was no blood, no distinctive fibers, and no technology for further analysis. But Mercer looked at location, not properties. The handkerchief lay near the water's edge under the sycamore, not far from the footpath that runs from the tracks down to the river. He redrew the scene map and realized something no one before him had noticed. If you connect the K9 scent loss point at the fence, the footprint direction, and the handkerchief location, you get a nearly straight line from the Halford backyard railroad track, Guadalupe River bank. The 3 points sat on the same axis, off by less than 2 degrees. Mercer capped his pen. "This can't be coincidence," he muttered. Even stranger, why had the original investigation focused so heavily on the VHS store direction, when every piece of physical evidence pointed toward the river and tracks? He dug deeper, and found the reasons. The VHS tape was treated as the only visual evidence, tilting the entire case that way. The fiber color mistake narrowed the suspect pool away from the track area, and the boy's statement, though matching the footprints, was dismissed as unreliable because of his age. All of it added up to one conclusion: the original investigation had been dangerously narrowed. Mercer stood, walked out of the records room, carrying the pages he had marked in red on nearly every important line, and went straight to the cold case lieutenant. When asked why he wanted the case reopened, Mercer simply handed over the map he had redrawn. "Look, sir," he said, "this is the path every piece of physical evidence points to. This is the path ignored in 1989. The lieutenant folded the papers, looked at Mercer, half surprised, half cautious. "You're saying," he said slowly, "the original direction was wrong?" Mercer didn't hesitate. "I think it was too narrow, sir. Not wrong, but narrow enough that everything else got forgotten. So what do you propose?" "I want to reopen the entire canvas list within the 3-block radius, especially anyone near the tracks." The commander tapped his fingers on the desk. "Anyone on that list, stand out." Mercer looked down at a name he had circled so hard it went through 3 sheets of paper, a name that had appeared faintly in the old reports, then been dropped because of one tiny forensic error no one ever revisited. He looked up. "Yes," he said, "one person." And just by connecting 3 forgotten details differently, Mercer reopened a door many thought was sealed forever. The cold case began heating up, from the smallest things. With Mercer establishing that the 3 overlooked clues, the boy's statement, the footprint direction, and the handkerchief, converged on the same path from the Halford house to the Guadalupe River bank. The next step was retesting evidence the 1989 lab couldn't handle: the small handkerchief. It had sat untouched for nearly 2 decades in storage, sealed in its evidence bag, catalogued as #02. Now forensics technology had far surpassed anything imaginable in 1989. When Mercer submitted the retesting request, the Texas State Lab responded immediately. They could apply touch DNA, the technique of extracting DNA from the tiniest skin cells left behind by touch. Touch DNA did not exist in 1989. By 2007, it was a powerful tool capable of completely changing a cold case's trajectory. The handkerchief was transported from storage to the lab in a sealed container. Technicians opened it in a clean room under cold white lights. The cotton was old and frayed, but that didn't matter. What mattered was whether skin cells remained on the fabric. Touch DNA doesn't need blood, sweat, or hair. It needs what people leave behind without realizing: microscopic skin flakes shed every time something is touched. One tech gently pressed specialized adhesive tape on the 2 stretched corners, the areas most likely to retain DNA over time. Another used a moistened swab along the top edge, where the faint brown stain had puzzled 1989 forensics. Every movement was slow, precise, and silent, as if they were handling something that could vanish with one small mistake. The swabs were then placed in the DNA extraction machine. The team waited. No one spoke loudly. Mercer stood outside the glass, arms crossed, staring at the analyzer screen. He knew they might get nothing. 20 years is a long time, but he also knew every recently solved cold case had started with DNA signals so weak they barely existed. When the machine beeped, the lead tech checked the readouts, whispered to the others, then called Mercer in. "We have DNA," the lead tech said. "Very weak, but it's there." He placed the genetic chart in front of Mercer, low, broken, faint peaks, an incomplete profile, but still a profile. Mercer exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. After nearly 2 decades, they finally had something 1989 couldn't even dream of, a microscopic DNA code, very likely from whoever touched the handkerchief, that might be connected to the night Kasey vanished. But that hope lasted only days before turning into new questions. The DNA was run against the Cumel County internal database. No match. The search radius was expanded 10 miles around the Halford house, covering most of New Braunfels, part of San Marcos, and areas near the interstate. No match. It was uploaded to the Texas CODIS statewide system. No match. The lab double-checked. The profile recovered from the handkerchief does not belong to any recorded resident within a 10-mile radius of Gruene Road in 1989. An unsettling void. Mercer leaned on the desk, staring at the report. That meant the DNA was not from anyone living near the Halford house. Not from any relative, neighbor, classmate, or previously sampled individual. Not from anyone who claimed to be near the scene. And most crucially, not from anyone suspected in 1989. The DNA belonged to a stranger, someone no one knew, someone who didn't live in the neighborhood, someone who never made the original suspect list because the suspect pool had been narrowed in the wrong direction from the start. Mercer leaned back in his chair. This wasn't bad news, but it wasn't good either. DNA with no local match meant 2 possibilities. 1. The person was a passerby, not a resident. 2. The person lived nearby, but moved away right after 1989. Or worse, 3. The person deliberately left no trace after that night. Mercer reanalyzed everything, footprints heading to the tracks, the boy's statement about a man lurking in the dark, the handkerchief location by the river, all pointing to the person who left the DNA not being anyone the Halfords knew. A chilling truth, the case might involve someone the town never recognized, who appeared and vanished in a single night. But even though the DNA matched no one, Mercer now had something 1989 never did, a profile, weak, but usable in the future as technology improved. A forensic tech told him, the data is too faint to search now, but strong enough to store. When technology improves, this profile can be reanalyzed and expanded. Mercer nodded. He knew this wasn't the breakthrough, but it was the first crack in the ice that had encased the file for nearly 20 years. And sometimes, in cases like this, a faint trace is worth more than a clear statement. Because traces don't lie. DNA, however weak, is still DNA. It can't be persuaded, frightened, or warped by memory. It just sits there, silent, but never gone. Mercer stood, resealed the handkerchief bag, and wrote one line in the file, a line no one in 1989 dared write. High probability perpetrator is from outside the neighborhood. Expand suspect radius. That was the moment the Kasey Halford case began warming up for the second time, thanks to a tiny trace once considered unimportant, and thanks to forensic technology the previous generation never had. The faint DNA profile pulled from the handkerchief gave Mercer hope, then disappointment almost as quickly, but it was the forensic tech who reminded him that in the new era, the value of DNA isn't only in a direct hit. Sometimes you don't need the exact person, the tech said. You just need someone connected to that person. That simple suggestion opened an investigative path no one in 1989 could have imagined. Genetic genealogy, the technique of using DNA structure to trace distant relatives and work backward to identify someone who isn't in any database. Mercer immediately uploaded the extremely weak sample to GED Match, the public, voluntary database, where millions of Americans had submitted their genetic profiles to trace family trees. Knowing the sample was faint, he still hoped some segment might match someone in the system. 4 weeks later, the lab called with a voice that mixed caution and excitement, "We have a match. Not strong, but enough to build a tree." Mercer was at the lab in 10 minutes. On the screen was a long list of names, most crossed out because the shared DNA was under 1%, but in the shared centimorgans column, one name glowed brighter than the rest: Hennings. Not a close match, just a distant branch, a faint genetic link. Still, it was the first family-related lead the case had ever produced. Mercer stared at the data, tapping his pen on the desk. Hennings. He had never seen that surname in the original files. No local had ever mentioned it. The lab explained, this person didn't live in New Braunfels in 1989, but based on the genetic similarity, the DNA on the handkerchief could belong to someone in the Hennings line. We have to map the whole tree to know which branch. Mercer got it. Genealogy isn't luck. It's a massive maze where every family branch can split into dozens, even hundreds of people. He contacted Dr. Amanda Croft, a Texas state genealogy expert who had helped crack several 2000s cold cases. Tall, thin, fast-talking but precise. When handed the Halford file, she only said, "I'll need a few weeks." Mercer didn't push. With genealogy, a few weeks meant days glued to screens, building trees, tracing ancestors through birth, marriage, and immigration records. One wrong branch, and the whole structure collapses. Nearly a month later, Dr. Croft called Mercer to her office. Spread across her desk was a family tree chart that nearly spanned the tabletop, tiny dots connected by straight and diagonal lines representing blood ties. She circled a section near the right edge in red. Here, she said, this branch has the closest genetic match to the handkerchief DNA. Mercer leaned in. At the end of the branch, Hennings, Randall. He raised an eyebrow. Hennings, Randall. Dr. Croft nodded. Looks that way. And he has another name. She flipped an attached document. I checked residency records. Born Randall Hennings, but from 1983 onward, he went by Randall Jessup. Mercer froze for several seconds. That name was familiar. He had seen it, in the 1989 file, page 4, on the list of people briefly interviewed, and marked with a tiny X at the end of the line. No match. Jessup, he was interviewed, Mercer said slowly, making sure his memory wasn't playing tricks. They cleared him because he wasn't wearing blue. Dr. Croft slid the folder toward him. Then you can start here. This tree shows he is very likely in the same direct line as the DNA source. Mercer sat down and reopened the 1989 file. The words, light gray polyester jacket, jumped out like a cruel reminder. Because forensics had mislabeled the fiber from gray to dark blue, Randall Jessup, birth name Randall Hennings, was dropped immediately. His name was crossed off. His statement was accepted as clean. He vanished from the investigation, not because he was innocent, but because a report got a color wrong. Mercer flipped to the 1989 interview transcript. Randall had claimed he walked to a convenience store 3 blocks from Gruene Road that night, and never went near the Halford house. He had no alibi, but because he didn't match the fiber color, the interview ended as quickly as it began. Mercer felt the blood in his veins slacken, then surge at the same time. Everything they had for 18 years, the handkerchief, the footprints, the boy's statement, pointed toward the tracks and the river. And now genetic genealogy had led them to a name that had literally sat across a table from investigators on day 2, but they never saw him, because of one visually misjudged detail. The old question rose again in Mercer's mind. If 1989 forensics hadn't gotten the color wrong, would the case have gone cold? But that question no longer mattered. What mattered was, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, they had a name. Randall Jessup, born Randall Hennings, and the closest genetic link to the DNA on the handkerchief. Mercer looked back at Dr. Croft. How strong is the genetic match? Not strong enough to say he's the source, she answered frankly, but strong enough to say, whoever left the DNA, and he are from the same direct family line. Mercer nodded slowly. That meant, if the DNA wasn't Randall's, it belonged to a cousin, uncle, or someone else in the branch, someone Randall was still connected to. But what bothered Mercer was another truth. Randall had lived in New Braunfels in 1989. Randall had been interviewed. Randall could walk to the tracks and river area. Randall wore a gray jacket, matching the actual fiber. Randall lived just a few streets away. Randall had slipped through the 1989 net because they looked at the wrong color. Mercer glanced at the family tree one last time and said quietly, "We might have missed him 35 years ago." Dr. Croft stood and gathered the papers. "That's how cold cases work. They don't die. They just wait for someone patient enough to find the mistakes of the past." Mercer folded the file and stood. For the first time since taking the case, he felt not just hope, but a real direction. A direction with a name, a history, a presence in the 1989 data, buried by one small error. As he was about to leave, Dr. Croft added one sentence that stopped him in his tracks. "The most interesting thing about genealogy isn't that it gives answers, it's that it tells you who to ask again, first." Mercer walked out, gripping the file tightly. The question was no longer whether Randall Jessup was involved. It was why had he disappeared from the investigation so easily. The Kasey Halford case had just changed. It was no longer a dead-end mystery. It had a path named Hennings, a path that had been standing right in front of them for 35 years. Once genealogy pointed straight at Randall Jessup, birth name Randall Hennings, Mercer knew the case had entered a completely new phase. But there was a serious problem. Residency records showed Randall had left New Braunfels in 1992, moved to East San Antonio, then kept relocating, Austin Kyle, back to a small town near Canyon Lake. For over 3 decades he had stayed off the radar. No arrests, no fingerprints on file, no DNA ever collected. He existed like a ghost, never causing trouble, never standing out, always on the edge of the system. That deliberate invisibility fit dangerously well with DNA that didn't match any 1989 resident within 10 miles. Mercer requested statewide surveillance authority. In January 2023, a small joint task force of Texas Rangers and New Braunfels PD was formed with one goal: obtain Randall Jessup's DNA through covert means. They began watching him in the tiny town of Blanco, where he now worked as a refrigeration tech for a local company. Every morning he drove the same old silver 1999 Ford F-150, left the house at 6:20, got coffee at the same gas station, then went to scheduled jobs. Every evening he stopped at H-E-B, bought the same 3 items: white bread, packaged sausage, cheap canned beer. Clockwork routine, but it gave the surveillance team no opening for DNA. Randall never littered. He took cans home. He didn't smoke, didn't spit gum, didn't drop wrappers. One officer half-joked, "He's clean like he knows we're looking for his DNA." Mercer didn't like the joke, but he knew it was partly true. A normal person leaves trash by accident. Someone hiding something doesn't. 3 weeks passed with 0 usable DNA, no hair on seats, no discarded cans, no razor blades, nothing disposable. Mercer changed tactics. If they couldn't get DNA from his routine, they would create the opportunity. On February 18, 2023, an undercover officer posing as a customer with a broken AC unit scheduled a service call. The plan was simple: controlled environment, collect something Randall touched while working. At the staged house, Randall arrived at 2:15 p.m. sharp, carrying his old tool bag, checked the unit, spoke little, worked fast. The undercover officer offered him water. Randall declined, saying he doesn't drink from strangers' houses. When finished, he took everything with him: rag, tools, even a scrap of paper he accidentally dropped. No skin cells left behind. The team grew frustrated. Mercer wrote in the report, "Subject exhibits extreme trace control behavior. High awareness. Only abnormal people act that way." Then 3 days later, opportunity arrived unexpectedly. On the evening of February 21st, Randall stopped at his usual old gas station off Highway 281. That night he bought beer, drank 1 can in the parking lot before driving off. Instead of taking the empty can home as always, he tossed it into the public trash can in the corner and left. Mercer was in a surveillance vehicle 30 meters away. He knew this chance might come only once. If Randall changed his mind tomorrow, they'd get nothing again. Mercer gave the order instantly: "Grab it, now, no one else touches it." Two officers reached the trash can less than a minute after Randall drove away. The can was still cold and beaded with condensation, definitely his. It was retrieved with gloved hands, sealed, taken to the car, and rushed to the lab that night. When the beer can entered the analyzer, the entire forensics room held its breath. The tech swabbed the rim, the part that had touched lips and skin, then fed it into the DNA extractor. The screen scrolled long strings of code, peaks flashing section by section, building the profile cycle by cycle. Mercer watched through the glass, one hand in his pocket, the other crushing the corner of the file. If no match, they were back to zero. If match, at 2:47 a.m., the machine let out a long beep, profile complete. The lid tech turned to Mercer, eyes unable to hide the tremor. Full profile, vente du loci, clean, no degradation. Run it against the handkerchief sample, Mercer said immediately. Silence. The room froze as the comparison ran. 5 seconds, 10, 20, then a red box flashed on screen. Match, 100%. No deviation, no error rate, no question. The DNA from Randall Jessup's beer can, birth name Randall Hennings, matched 100% with the trace DNA recovered from evidence #02, the handkerchief found in 1989. There was no way to deny it. Not a distant relative, not genealogy probability. This was the person who touched the handkerchief. This was his DNA. Mercer stood motionless, saying nothing. He just stared at the blinking match that cut through 35 years of darkness. Finally, after 3 decades, the little handkerchief everyone had dismissed as insignificant had spoken, and it spoke in a language no one could argue with. DNA doesn't lie, DNA doesn't fade with time. DNA had just unmasked Randall Jessup. The Kasey Halford case was no longer cold. It was back, and this time, it had one target. Randall Jessup was called in for questioning on a March morning in 2023. No cuffs, no Miranda rights read, no arrest. Legally, it was just a voluntary interview. The wording Mercer chose deliberately. He wanted to watch the man at his most confident, most free, because that's when liars slip. Randall walked into the interview room slowly, shoulders slightly hunched, ball cap pulled low over his eyes. No lawyer. He probably thought he was just an old witness being re-asked routine questions, like in 1989. Mercer sat across the table, hands folded over the thick file, not opening it yet. "Thank you for coming," Mercer said calmly. "We're just reviewing some old cases, and have a few questions." Randall nodded, no visible nerves. "Sure, I already told y'all, I don't know anything about that." Mercer smiled, face giving away nothing. "We'll see." He started easy, where Randall lived in 1989, what he did for work, basic background. Randall answered smoothly, almost too smoothly, like he had rehearsed for this moment years ago. But Mercer wasn't interested in those parts. He was waiting for the 1984 Ford pickup, the truck Randall owned when Kasey vanished, then erased from all records 2 months later. When Mercer shifted to the truck, Randall leaned back slightly, an involuntary tell. "You used to drive a 1984 silver Ford F-150, right?" Mercer asked. "Yeah," Randall said. "Sold it. Long time ago. Who'd you sell it to?" Randall frowned. I don't remember the name. Some guy, stranger." Mercer twirled his pen. "Where'd you sell it?" Randall looked at the table. "Parking lot off 46. Put up a for sale sign." He came, looked, bought it. Mercer opened the file for the first time. "We checked every used vehicle transaction in Cumberland County for 1989. Nothing about that truck being sold." Randall stiffened, just for a second, but Mercer saw it. "I remember selling it," he stammered. Mercer turned another page. "No title transfer, no plate cancellation, no payment record. Even if you sold it off paper, someone had to re-register it." Randall swallowed. Maybe he never registered it." Mercer nodded. "Maybe." He paused a few seconds for silence. "You remember what month you sold it, Randall?" "Probably June, maybe July, something like that." Mercer slid over a 1989 calendar page, from court records, when Randall had been cited for disorderly conduct in early August. "You were pulled over August 3, 1989. You told the officer you were driving the 1984 pickup." Randall's eyes widened. I don't remember. Meaning, Mercer continued, at least into early August you still owned the truck. Randall clenched his hands. Maybe I sold it after. After August? Yeah, probably. We talked to the scrapyards nearby. Mercer said slowly, each word deliberate. No one remembers you bringing it in. No demolition paperwork. No one bought an '84 truck with no title at the end of 1989. New emissions laws made that impossible. Randall bit his lip. First time he was behind. Mercer looked him dead in the eye. You didn't sell that pickup. Randall glanced away, blinking fast. I don't remember exactly. Mercer nodded. I believe that. I think there's a lot about 1989 you don't remember exactly. So help me understand one thing. He opened the 1989 interview transcript. Back then you said you never went down Gruene Road the night Kasey disappeared. Randall stared at the paper like it was alien. Right, I wasn't there. Mercer flipped to the area map. But your house was 2 streets away. To get to the convenience store like you claimed, you had to cross right here. He tapped the pen on the exact intersection that led to the narrow path where footprints headed toward the tracks. Randall's hands trembled slightly. I took a different way. Which way? The back road. Mercer waited. Name of the road. Randall didn't answer. A long silence filled the room. Mercer continued, voice low but sharp, and you don't remember who bought the truck. Don't remember when you sold it. Don't remember why a gray polyester fiber, exact match for the jacket you wore, was found in the Halford backyard. Randall opened his mouth. No sound came out. You also don't remember why your DNA is on evidence recovered from the Guadalupe River bank, do you? The question landed like a boulder. Randall stared at Mercer as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. His eyes narrowed, searching for the bluff. But Mercer wasn't bluffing. DNA doesn't bluff. I wasn't there, Randall whispered. It was the weakest denial Mercer had heard in 30 years of investigations. He jotted a note. Statement changed third time. Stress, evasion, loss of control. The interview ended without a confession, but it didn't need one. Mercer stood, closed the file. Thanks for coming in, Randall. We'll talk again. And when Randall walked out, shoulders drawn in, steps unsteady, what Mercer saw wasn't the indignation of an innocent man wrongly accused. He saw the fear of someone who knew his time was up. The first interview didn't need answers. It only needed contradictions, and Randall had just given them all. After the first interview, Randall left the station looking calm on the outside, but Mercer knew the contradictions he left behind were enough for the first search warrant in the 30-plus years this case had existed. When the judge signed it, the team waited until Randall was at work in Blanco, then hit the small house he rented off Ranch Road 32, and especially the old tin shed out back, a leaning, forgotten structure the family had stopped using in the late 90s. According to county records, that shed had never been cleaned out or renovated since 1991. The tin door screeched open. Inside was dark, thick with dust and the heavy smell of decades of damp. Flashlight beams swept across rotting cardboard boxes, broken-legged tables, and a few crates of family junk no one had ever thrown away. Mercer walked in front, every footstep kicking up dust like memories taking flight. Less than a minute later, a Texas Ranger on the left called out, "Over here, you need to see this." In the far back corner, under a plastic tub covered in spiderwebs and dirt, they found a personal storage box. Mercer lifted it with gloved hands and set it on a rotted wooden table. Inside were 3 items that made the entire team fall silent for several seconds. First item, a light gray polyester jacket, thin, collared, the exact style popular with late-nightus 80s teens. Mercer recognized it instantly. It matched the 1989 officer's description of what Randall wore during his original interview. Covered in dust, but the shoulder and collar fabric was unmistakably the same polyester found in the Halford backyard. No question left, the 1989 fiber came from a jacket exactly like this one. The color mistake from long ago had finally come back demanding answers. Second item at the bottom of the box, a 1987 new Braunfels street map, folded 4 times, paper yellowed with age. When Mercer unfolded it, he saw faint pencil marks on several areas, one of them Gruene Road. A thin pencil line ran from the Halford house toward the railroad tracks. then curved down to the Guadalupe River bank, the exact path described by footprints and the boy's statement. He marked the route, a ranger whispered. Mercer shook his head. We can't conclude yet, but this isn't a map an innocent person keeps locked in a shed for 30 years. The third item silenced everyone longer than the first two combined. A cheap white plastic bracelet, the kind sold in packs at supermarkets in the 1980s. Small, child-sized. Mercer held it in his gloved palm. The flashlight beam glinted off the matte plastic. Could it be Kasey's? One officer guessed. Mercer wasn't sure. The Halford family had never reported a missing bracelet like this. Kasey rarely wore jewelry, according to her mother. This bracelet might mean nothing. It could belong to some other kid, or someone who had once come and gone from the shed. Pull touch DNA, Mercer ordered. The item was sealed and sent straight to the Austin Forensics Lab. While waiting for results, the team finished tearing the shed apart. They found more old papers, receipts, family photos, nothing as significant as the three items in the box. Mercer stood at the doorway watching, his chest heavy as lead. He knew old sheds were where secrets got shoved in, locked away, and left for time to erase. But time hadn't been strong enough. Not 1 year had managed to wipe the real traces clean. 2 days later, the lab emailed the preliminary report. Mercer got it at 6:42 a.m. The first 3 lines made him bolt upright from his chair. Plastic bracelet does not belong to victim Kasey Halford. However, touch DNA detected on surface. DNA matches epithelial cells of Kasey Lynn Halford. For several seconds, Mercer just stared at the screen, motionless. The bracelet, something that had seemed irrelevant, carried Kasey's skin cells. Not hair, not blood, not fingerprints. Just microscopic skin cells that no 1989 method could have detected. But in 2023, touch DNA spoke for them all. Kasey had touched that bracelet, and that bracelet had sat in Randall's shed for 30 years. There was no innocent explanation for that. Mercer read the final line of the report. Random match probability, with victim profile, 1 in 28 trillion. That number was a verdict all by itself. The bracelet wasn't Kasey's, but Randall had kept it. One small anonymous trophy carrying the only DNA of the little girl outside the handkerchief ever preserved in the file. Mercer went back to the shed that same day just to look at them again. The gray jacket, the marked-up map, the little plastic bracelet. Then it hit him like ice down his spine. The shed wasn't just old family storage, it was where he had hidden the last 3 pieces of the night Kasey disappeared, and now those pieces had finally seen daylight. Finding the gray jacket, the 1987 New Braunfels map marked with the route from Gruene Road to the Guadalupe River bank, and the plastic bracelet bearing Kasey's touch DNA told Mercer the case had crossed a line. This was no longer mere investigation. This was the moment to take the file upstairs, to the Como County Grand Jury. Preparing for grand jury required absolute precision. Mercer spent nearly 2 weeks structuring everything into an airtight chain: timeline, physical evidence, forensics, genealogy, interview, suspicious behavior, new physical finds. He welded them into a sequence, so ruthless there was no room left for reasonable doubt. The grand jury session took place on a Tuesday morning, in a small sealed courtroom. The special panel, 12 Como County citizens, sat in silence as Mercer entered with 2 Texas Rangers. Mercer opened with the 1989 timeline, but he didn't drag it out. He only stated what Randall had been unable to explain. Randall lived 2 streets from the Halfords. His statement contradicted the traffic map of the time. The 1984 pickup could not legally vanish from records if sold. He had no verifiable alibi. Then Mercer moved to forensics, the part no one in the room expected to hit that hard. He presented 1. Gray polyester fiber, evidence #03, color misrecorded in 1989 report. Re-examined, identical to fibers from the jacket stored in Randall's shed. 2. Footprints heading toward railroad tracks Guadalupe River bank, matched location where the 10-year-old boy saw a man. 3. Handkerchief, evidence #02 2007. Touch DNA produced a weak foreign profile. 2023 beer can sample from Randall, 100% match. 4. Plastic bracelet, not owned by Kasey, but carried her epithelial DNA. Found in Randall family shed. The room went dead quiet. One juror asked, "Could this be coincidence?" Mercer answered only with the lab's line, "Random match probability, 1 in 28 trillion. No one asked anything else. After forensics came genealogy, the piece that had flipped the entire case. Handkerchief DNA linked to distant relatives and GED match under the Hennings surname. Randall was born Randall Hennings, changed name to Jessup in 1983, after parents split. He lived right in the zone forensics said the abductor traversed. Another juror asked, "So is this direct evidence?" Mercer was blunt. "Genealogy itself is not convicting evidence, but it led us to direct DNA, and that DNA is a 100% match to Randall Jessup." A ranger stepped forward and laid out the interview documents. Randall lied about the 1984 pickup, lied about his route that night, could not explain keeping a map marked with Gruene Road, could not explain evidence bearing Kasey's DNA in his shed. Taken together, it was no longer suspicion. It was the classic pattern of a perpetrator hiding traces for decades. Throughout the presentation, Randall was not present by law. He is not allowed in the grand jury room. His absence only made the file sharper. When Mercer finished, the jurors retired to deliberate. It took nearly 40 minutes, longer than most cases, but when they returned, the foreperson spoke clearly. "We vote to indict Randall Jessup for kidnapping and serious bodily injury to a minor." No one in the room was surprised. No one asked more. No one objected. But just as Mercer was packing up to leave, a court clerk rushed in and whispered something to the prosecutor. The prosecutor frowned, then looked at Mercer. "Someone just walked in voluntarily." Mercer turned. "Who?" "A 1989 witness. The one who reported seeing car lights come on." Mercer felt his chest tighten again. That woman, Linda Maynard, had vanished from the file for 3 decades. No one found her during the 1993 canvass. No one knew where she moved. She had stopped answering calls. Police had decided her memory was too vague to help. But now, on the very day the grand jury indicted Randall, she showed up, shaking, clutching an old purse, telling the clerk, "I remembered something else. I think I've remembered it wrong for 35 years. Mercer hurried into the hallway. Linda stood there, much older, but her eyes still sharp. "What do you want to tell me?" Mercer asked. She swallowed hard. "That night, the car lights I saw. It wasn't just the lights coming on." A short pause. "I saw a door open." Mercer froze. Every detail of the case suddenly snapped into perfect focus. Linda whispered, "I wasn't sure before, but now, I remember clearly. Someone was pulling something into the car." Mercer didn't ask anything else. He didn't need to. The case already had a grand jury indictment. Now it had a witness no one thought would ever come back after 3 decades. The trial of Randall Jessup, birth name Randall Hennings, opened in November 2023 at the Comal County Courthouse, in a courtroom barely big enough for a few dozen seats, yet packed that day as if the entire town of New Braunfels was holding its breath. 34 years of waiting had brought the Kasey Halford case to the point of no return. Every piece of evidence, every statement, every 1989 mistake, every technological breakthrough, now laid out neatly on the prosecution table. Randall sat at the defense table, thinner, hair going gray, eyes no longer carrying the confidence he had when he first walked into the interview room. He wore a light gray shirt, a color many in the room noticed with cruel irony. The prosecutor opened with a single sentence that silenced the courtroom. "We will prove through science, through forensics, through genealogy, and through the defendant's own actions, that Randall Jessup touched the handkerchief bearing Kasey's DNA, kept an item with her DNA in his shed, and deliberately destroyed every trace." The trial moved to its core, the forensic expert testimony, the heart of the case. Fiber analysis. The fiber once overlooked Texas DPS fiber analyst Dr. Eliza Harburn took the stand. She was the one who had re-examined every 1989 item. Harburn began with a hard truth. The original 1989 report misrecorded the polyester fiber color from light gray to dark blue. That error caused investigators to eliminate an entire suspect group, including Randall Jessup. Defense counsel immediately objected, claiming 1989 forensics lacked technology. Halford didn't argue. She simply showed the comparison photos. 2023 spectral light photo of the fiber silver gray jacket recovered from Randall's shed, identical fiber type, color, weave pattern. Statistical match rarity, extremely rare by forensic standards. Prosecution asked, what is the probability the backyard fiber came from the defendant's jacket? Halford answered flatly, statistically virtually certain. Randall stared at the table, biting his lip, fingers drumming fast as if trying to hide the tension. Touch DNA, traces that survived 34 years. Next was Houston forensics DNA expert Dr. Melanie Ruiz, who had personally tested the handkerchief, #02, and the plastic bracelet. Ruiz walked through the process. Handkerchief, labeled undetermined, in 1989, no technology available. 2007, Touch DNA, produced a very weak foreign profile, enough to store. 2023 full DNA profile, from Randall's surveilled beer can. Prosecution asked, please tell the jury, do the DNA profiles from the handkerchief and from the defendant match? Ruiz answered without hesitation, 100% match. No error, no possibility of mistake. It is the DNA of the same individual. The courtroom rippled with gasps. Some people couldn't hold back sharp breaths. Defense counsel jumped up. DNA can be contaminated. The handkerchief was outdoors, handled by others. Ruiz cut him off with one sentence that silenced the room. Touch DNA doesn't work that way. DNA does not attach itself to a surface after 30 years. It had to be deposited at the time the item was left behind. The prosecution didn't need to add another word. DNA is the argument that cannot be argued with. Genealogy triangle, the genealogical triangle. At this point the prosecution called Dr. Amanda Croft, the genealogist, who had built the Hennings family tree. She presented the genealogy triangle, a method that rests on 3 data points. 1. Shared centimorgans, from GED match. 2. Historical genealogy, birth records, name change records. 3. Residential location, matching the 1989 timeline. Result. The Hennings branch produced a genetic cluster, matching the handkerchief sample. Within the entire branch, only one person lived in New Braunfels at the exact time Kasey vanished. That person was Randall Hennings, who changed his name to Randall Jessup in 1983. Defense counsel asked, genealogy cannot conclude the defendant committed the crime, correct? Croft gave a faint smile, correct. Genealogy doesn't name the perpetrator. It only points to the right door to knock on. And when you opened that door, you found a 100% DNA match. The triangle of genealogy, forensics, timeline closed without a single gap. Randall testifies, and contradicts himself after the 3 forensic experts. Randall was called to the stand to speak in his own defense. His attorney advised him to remain silent, but Randall was too confident in his ability to control the narrative. That was the biggest mistake he ever made. Question 1. Where were you on the night of June 24, 1989? Randall, at a friend's house. We were watching TV. Prosecution held up the file. Your friend testified the opposite. He said he didn't see you that night. Randall swallowed hard, but tried to stay calm. Question 2. Where is your 1984 pickup? Sold it, he answered. Prosecution produced DMV records. No transaction, no title transfer, no plate cancellation. Explain. Randall snapped. I don't remember. Question 3. Whose is the plastic bracelet in your shed? No idea. Maybe my niece's. Your niece was born in 2001, the prosecutor countered. That bracelet was discontinued in 1990, and the touch DNA on it is Kasey Halford's. Randall froze. His breathing became ragged. Question 4. Why is your DNA on the handkerchief found at the Guadalupe River bank? Randall was visibly sweating. I don't know. Someone faked it. The prosecutor spoke slowly, each word driving into the cracks. DNA cannot be faked. It cannot jump on. It cannot appear by itself. After 30 years, there is only one way DNA ends up on that handkerchief. You touched it. The courtroom fell silent. Randall licked his lips, eyes bloodshot, the signs of a man who had lost control of the story. Defense counsel intervened and ended the cross-examination, but the damage was done. Randall had not only failed to defend himself, he had created a fresh string of contradictions: vague alibi, false statement about the truck, absurd explanation for the evidence, scientifically impossible denial of the DNA, tone shifts when pinned to the timeline. Every contradiction was another knife, cutting deeper into the prosecution's case. The forensic portion of the trial closes when the prosecutor asked the final question: if you had nothing to do with it, why do you have a map in your house showing the exact route? Forensics says the footprints and handkerchief followed. Randall did not answer. He could not answer. The court recessed, but no one in the room still had any doubt. Science had spoken, and Randall, with his own testimony, had just tightened the noose around his own neck. The trial now only awaited the verdict. The trial lasted 8 days in total. 8 days of forensics testimony, cross-examination, and Randall's unmaskable contradictions. On the 9th day the jury retired to deliberate. No one knew how long they would take, hours, maybe a full day, but after only 95 minutes they returned. Short enough that both prosecution and defense understood the decision had been obvious. As the jurors took their seats, the courtroom was dead silent. The foreperson stood, holding the folded verdict slip. He looked straight at the judge and spoke clearly. We find the defendant, Randall Jessup, guilty on all counts. The prosecution did not smile. Mercer only exhaled softly. Kasey's mother bowed her head, hands clenched white, and Randall simply closed his eyes, dropped his head, shoulders collapsing, as if the sentence just read was the one he had feared for 34 years. The judge wasted no time. He read the sentence in a voice heavy and cold as steel. Based on the forensic evidence, fiber analysis, touch DNA, genealogy results, the defendant's conduct, and the jury's verdict, the court sentences Randall Jessup to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. No conditions, no chance of reduction, no opportunity to walk free ever again. When the words "without parole" were spoken, Randall burst out in near desperation. No, I didn't do. The judge slammed the gavel. Defendant will remain orderly. Defense counsel touched his arm, but Randall jerked away. His eyes scanned the courtroom, not for sympathy, but for an exit. There was none. DNA had closed the door. Genealogy had closed the door. The fiber had closed the door, and his own testimony had locked it. An officer stepped forward to cuff him. Randall backed away, muttering, "There's no body, there's nothing you can't." The judge cut in, as if he had been waiting for that exact line. This is a no-body conviction. Texas law recognizes it. We do not need a body, we only need the truth. That sentence sliced off every last protest. For the first time Randall said nothing more. The steel cuffs clicked shut. He lowered his head, hair covering half his face, and took heavy steps across the wooden floor. Each footfall echoed like the final sounds of 34 years of guilt. The Halford family did not applaud, did not sob loudly, did not celebrate. They simply stood, silent, exhausted, but finally hearing the official words they once thought they would never hear. As the guards led Randall out the side door, noon sunlight streamed through the windows and fell across his shirt, the same silver gray as the jacket from long ago, the color of the very fiber that had reversed his fate. A reporter whispered, 34 years, there's never been a case quite like this. Mercer leaned quietly against the railing, saying nothing. He knew what everyone was witnessing was not just a sentence for Randall, it was a sentence for a 1989 mistake, for 34 years of silent evidence, for questions left unanswered, a no-body conviction, a plastic bracelet, an old handkerchief, a gray fiber, a touch of DNA, just that, and Randall Jessup had to pay with the rest of his life. No body conviction, but the truth still spoke. Randall Jessup was transferred to Huntsville Unit 3 weeks after sentencing. He was placed on Leffers Row, the block for those serving life without parole, men who have nothing left to lose. Here there are no reporters, no family visits, no more than 1 hour of yard time per day. Every footstep he takes on the concrete corridors echoes with the thick sound of finality. Mercer had no intention of ever seeing Randall again. The sentence was handed down, the DNA had spoken, nothing remained. But in early January 2024, Mercer received a call from the warden. "Mr. Mercer, Randall Jessup wants to see you again." Mercer paused. "Why?" "We don't know, but he said, I need to talk to the detective." He gave your exact name. An unplanned meeting is always dangerous. But with a detective's instinct, Mercer understood. Criminals like Randall sometimes only start telling the truth once they realize the outside world has completely turned its back. Mercer drove to Huntsville 2 days later. Randall sat in the visitation room, hands cuffed in front, face noticeably gaunt. The aggressive glare from trial was gone. All that remained was a weary emptiness, the look of a man who knows he will die inside 4 walls and be forgotten. Mercer sat across from him. "What do you want to say?" Randall gave a faint, soulless smile. "You know, everyone thought I was so smart, but really, I was stupid. Really stupid." Mercer stayed silent. Randall looked down, fingers twisting together. "You found the jacket, the map, the plastic bracelet, all the things I thought no one would ever see." Mercer spoke slowly. "You left more traces than you realized." Randall nodded once, very slowly. "Yeah, I left traces no one thought mattered." That sentence made Mercer sit up straighter. "What traces are you talking about?" Randall looked Mercer straight in the eye, and for the first time since the case reopened, there was no attempt to deceive, no anger, no defiance, just emptiness. "I took the wrong road," Randall said, "and I thought no one would ever find out. 30 years, I thought I'd won." "But you're not saying what?" Mercer pressed. "What trace did you leave?" Randall let out a long rasping breath. "A trace that leads to the place, something I forgot about." Mercer leaned forward. "What place?" Randall didn't answer immediately. He glanced at the door, as if something there terrified him to name. After several seconds he whispered, "You think you've found everything, but there's still one spot where I thought no one would ever dig." Mercer didn't move, staying quiet so Randall would keep talking. Randall licked his lips, eyes darting. "I can't say it all. I don't want to. I don't." He stopped, lightly punching his own forehead as if punishing himself. "But you're right about one thing. I left something I never thought forensics would find. Something that lasted longer than I thought. I forgot about it. I forgot for 30 years. Mercer asked one last time, "Are you talking about Kasey Halford's remains?" Randall didn't answer, but his eyes, wet, red, trembling, were the answer. He did not confess the crime. He did not give an exact location. He did not draw a map, but he had said enough to confirm one critical truth: there is a trace and there is a place that he knows, and no one has yet found the right spot. As the guards led Randall away, he turned his head one final time and muttered, "You'll find it, because you're different from them. You look for what I couldn't hide." Mercer stood alone in the visitation room, the words drilling into him like cold steel. "I left traces no one thought mattered." The words of a man who had hidden the truth for 34 years now became a new roadmap, an incomplete confession, half opening a door, but not walking through it. And the Kasey Halford case, even with a guilty verdict, was not yet closed. 34 years, 2 generations of investigators, 5 file reviews, hundreds of pages of reports, 3 pieces of evidence small as dust, and finally, the Kasey Halford case reached the verdict many thought would never come. But even after Randall Jessup received life without parole, the Kasey file was not sealed. Not because the justice system lacked a final signature, but because the truth still lacked its most important piece: the location of her remains. The Como County Investigation Unit keeps this file open, under the special status, "Conviction obtained, remains pending." On the cover, in Mercer's fresh black ink, "Search continues." The original mistakes, the hard lessons of 1989. The original 1989 file contained errors whose full severity only became clear once modern forensic technology arrived. First mistake, the polyester fiber was recorded in the wrong color. One tiny detail, so tiny, sent the entire investigation down the wrong path. A gray polyester fiber that looked dark blue under the yellow lights of 1989 caused investigators to eliminate every suspect living near the tracks, including Randall. From that moment, the case veered miles off course. Second mistake, relying too heavily on the VHS tape. The blurry, grainy video was treated as the only camera evidence, derailing the case for 3 critical weeks. In those 3 weeks, physical traces were washed away, witness memories faded, and Randall slipped completely off the radar. Third mistake, dismissing the 10-year-old boy's statement. That statement, about a man standing by the fence, matched the 1989 forensics perfectly. But in 1989, a child's memory was considered unreliable. 30 years later, it became the key that restarted the investigation in the right direction. Fourth mistake, treating small items as unimportant. The handkerchief, scraps of paper, the plastic bracelet, once labeled secondary evidence. Yet those very items, the ones pushed aside, became the backbone of the case in 2023. These mistakes did not come from negligence. They came from the era, technology, methods, knowledge. None of it was sufficient at the time. But recognizing and correcting those mistakes is exactly what saved the case. New technology, the language of forensics that saved the case, not a witness, not a confession, not luck. The case was solved by science. Touch DNA. Even the smallest trace has a voice. The handkerchief on the riverbank, once deemed worthless, had preserved an amount of DNA, so tiny that 1989 technology couldn't see it. Almost 2 decades later, touch DNA finally became sensitive enough to extract it. Thanks to that, forensics obtained the first weak profile, the sign of an outsider to the neighborhood. Then, in 2023, when Randall's DNA was collected from the beer can, touch DNA reached its full power, 100% match. Genealogy, the family line that led the way. If 1989 forensics only asked who, 2023 genealogy asked which family line. The Hennings branch appeared. Randall Hennings had changed his name to Jessup, and his name had already been on the 1989 interview list, only to be eliminated early. Genealogy didn't just point to the killer, it pointed to the door investigators had to open again. Modern forensics, breaking a 34-year wall of silence. No reanalyzed fiber, the case stays cold. No touch DNA, the case stays cold. No genealogy, the case stays cold. No modern surveillance DNA collection from a beer can, the case stays cold. The Kasey Halford case proves technology doesn't just solve cases. Technology corrects the mistakes of the past. The body has still not been found, but the truth has come to light. After Randall's conviction, Mercer and the team continued expanding the search based on his vague prison hint. I left a trace no one thought mattered. They returned to the railroad tracks. They re-scanned parcels never before searched. They used ground-penetrating radar, GPS. They dug up 1980s survey maps to study terrain changes. They reopened even the faintest old statements. But Kasey's remains have still not been located. And strangely, even though he is serving life without parole, Randall has never admitted guilt. He only leaves half sentences, as if keeping one last shred of control. Not by the river, not where you think. There's something I forgot. In many nobody convictions, this is the final chapter of the file. But for Mercer, it is not the end. I search with forensics. He hides with memory, Mercer said, and memory can die. Forensics cannot. Final words. For the cases still sleeping, the Kasey Halford case became one of the rare nobody convictions in Comal County history. It is not only a victory for forensics, not only an honor for the cold case team, not only closure for the Halford family's pain, it is a reminder to every investigator, every forensic expert, every family still waiting for an answer. No case is ever truly cold. There are only cases waiting for the right person, the right technology, the right moment to be reopened. Some cases need a witness, some need a confession, but some, like Kasey's, only need a gray fiber, a skin cell, a family tree branch, and one detective who refuses to give up. When Mercer closed the evidence box, late afternoon light streamed through the room and fell on the 3 sealed items: the gray fiber, the handkerchief, the plastic bracelet, 3 tiny things that kept a secret for 34 years, and finally broke a case wide open. The line that forensic investigators always repeat to one another, Mercer wrote at the end of the final report, as a message to the future: cold cases aren't cold, they are patient. Looking back at the story, New Braunfels 1989 cold case solved, it's impossible not to think about America today, where thousands of people still go missing every year, thousands of families live in no-answer limbo. Kasey's case gives us one very concrete lesson: the truth does not die, but if we let go, the truth can stay buried a very long time. Just one wrong color recorded on a polyester fiber, from gray to blue in 1989, caused police to drop Randall from the suspect list, and sent the entire investigation down the wrong road. That is a reminder for all of us, in everyday life, from office work to medicine, finance and investigations, that small details are never small, and a culture of just get it done can cost an entire community for decades. The 10-year-old boy's statement was dismissed simply because he was a child. 30 years later, the direction a man standing right by the fence matched the footprints and the map in Randall's shed perfectly. That is a very American message. Listen to children, to victims, to the vulnerable. Their voices may tremble, but they are often the most important piece of the puzzle. Technologies like touch DNA, genealogy, CODIS, GED match in this story aren't just cool science for true crime podcasts. They remind us to support investment in science data and long-term record keeping, because those very systems will one day speak for people who no longer have a voice. The image of Detective Mercer stubbornly reopening dusty files, re-examining the handkerchief, the plastic bracelet, is a model for every individual in American society. Some things don't pay off immediately, but if we stay patient, admit mistakes, keep learning, and never abandon victims, justice, even if slow, can still arrive. And perhaps, in this vast country, we all need to remember one very real thing from this case. Sometimes the only thing standing between darkness and justice is one person's decision to never give up. If you believe stories like Kasey Halford's deserve to be told to the end, please hit subscribe to walk with us as we keep bringing light to files the world thought were forgotten. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video with another journey in search of truth.